Hi, this is Paul with another English language A-level video. This is a second video which is about original writing the short story. Okay, so in this process, you're going to have to read a lot of short stories. You're going to have to kind of immerse yourself in the genre of the very short story. Because after all, what you're going to be producing is a mini story. It's only 750 words. So we're talking about kind of like a side and a half of narrative fiction. So we have in the booklet a whole load of 30 short stories, which are listed for you on page 18. So it's a good idea for you to be reading as many of these short stories as possible and to think of them in the following terms. First of all, what seems to you the most interesting aspect of this narrative? Secondly, what is the writer trying to make you think and feel at different points? Because if it's a successful piece of narrative fiction, then clearly you're going to be thinking and feeling different things at the start, in the middle, and at the end. So what is the writer trying to do to you as the reader? Think about the plot. So how would you summarize the plot development in the narrative? Remembering, of course, that a very short story may be quite minimal in terms of plot. It's not like a Hollywood movie, so there may not be a lot of action that happens in the plot. And instead, actually, the main interest may be about characterization. So in which case, how has the writer created interest in the main characters of the narrative? And with such a short piece of narrative fiction, there is unlikely to be more than 3 main characters. What about the atmosphere or the tone of the text? So how would you describe the mood of the piece? And is it static, or does the atmosphere change as the narrative develops? Honing in on the title. What's going on with the title? Why has the writer chosen that particular title? What does it tell us about the ideas or the mood of the story? And what about the opening? So how has the writer used language right at the beginning of this story to try and grab your attention? Think about narrative perspective. So which of the different choices has the writer chosen? First, second, or third person? And why have they done that? So what has that narrative perspective choice enabled that writer to do? Think also about the writer's use of time. So have they told their story entirely in the past tense, entirely in the present tense, or indeed have they mixed around their use of time in the narrative? And then finally, these 3 questions. Dialogue. So if there is dialogue in your story, what is it contributing to the story? Maybe it's giving you quite a lot in terms of characterization. The setting. What part does setting play in the narrative? And then finally, what's going on at the end? So, how has the writer completed the story and how does it make you think and feel? So you need to be reading as many of these short stories as possible. And then ultimately, when you're getting to choose your style model, then you need to be applying these sorts of questions. On the next slide, we've got lists of these sorts of very short stories. Let me do an example of the sorts of things that I would be wanting to say about a particular story. So this is a story that's in your booklet. It's by Graham Greene, the 20th century writer, and it's called The Case for the Defence. And here are the first 2 paragraphs. Just make that a bit smaller. It was the strangest murder trial I ever attended. They named it the Peckham murder in the headlines, though Northwood Street, where the old woman was found battered to death, was not, strictly speaking, in Peckham. This was not one of those cases of circumstantial evidence in which you feel the jurymen's anxiety because mistakes have been made, like domes of silence muting the court. No, this murderer was all but found with the body. No one present when the Crown Counsel outlined his case believed that the man in the dock stood any chance at all. He was a heavy, stout man with bulging, bloodshot eyes. All his muscles seemed to be in his thighs. Yes, an ugly customer, one you wouldn't forget in a hurry. And that was an important point because the Crown proposed to call 4 witnesses who hadn't forgotten him, who had seen him hurrying away from the little red villa in Northwood Street. Now, there you are. So Graham Greene is such a brilliant writer that he sets up interest and intrigue in this story right from the beginning. We've got this first sentence. It was the strangest murder trial I ever attended. Notice here the use of the superlative adjective. So we're drawn in right from the beginning because this superlative adjective kind of creates interest. It draws attention to the kind of unusual nature of the case. In terms of perspective, this is clearly first-person singular narrative perspective. And we can glean from the details here that the writer, the implied writer, is some kind of reporter. They're a journalist. So you, the reader, infer that the implied narrator is a journalist and therefore accustomed to reporting gruesome court cases, instances where people are being battered to death. Okay. What else have we got? We've got very precise names of places in London. It's Peckham, it's Northwood Street. So you've got your proper nouns there, which really suggest authenticity. These are real places. We're not in some kind of fantasy world. We have a little bit of figurative language being used here where he says, like domes of silence muting the court. So that's quite a striking, unusual simile. And it establishes quite a sinister atmosphere, which is not surprising because it's about a murder trial. We have lexis from the semantic field of the court and justice. And so that therefore efficiently kind of conveys the solemnity, the formality of the situation. So words like dock and Crown Counsel. What else have we got? We've got the end of that first paragraph gives us a little bit of cataphoria, because it's kind of suggesting that the guilty verdict is inevitable. In the second paragraph, we've got some characterization. So we're drawn in to actually visually see the character. He was a very heavy, stout man with bulging, bloodshot eyes. And so you've got these pre-modifying adjectives like heavy, stout, bulging, and bloodshot, and they play upon the reader's kind of stereotypical assumptions about ugliness and perhaps about guilt as well. And you've got this style which incorporates some kind of speech features where you've got no in the first paragraph and then yes over here. So it creates the impression that the narrator is actually chatting to you directly. Okay, so that's kind of synthetic personalization. Okay, so these are the sorts of ideas that are swilling around my mind when I'm reading the first two paragraphs of the case for the defence. Okay, so it would be a good idea for you to be looking at the case for the defence and trying to annotate in the same way other parts of the story. Okay, let's move on and let's think about some quotations from short story writers about the whole art of short story writing. Edith Wharton calls short story writing a shaft driven straight into the heart of human experience. Highly emotive image that's used. George Saunders says, short stories are the deep encoded crystallizations of all human knowledge. They are rarefied, dense meaning machines, shedding light on the most pressing of life's dilemmas. So it's really interesting because they are making very bold claims about the worth of short stories, which you might say are kind of second rate or considered by many to be kind of in the second division of world literature. They're not great tragic plays by William Shakespeare. They're not hefty novels by Charles Dickens. They're very short, but these writers are really talking about the importance of this as an experience. Anton Chekhov is considered the master of the short story. Concision is the sister of talent. Concision means being concise. Short stories are tiny windows into other worlds and other minds and other dreams. They are journeys you can make to the far side of the universe and still be back in time for dinner. I love the image there. A short story is a love affair. A novel is a marriage. A short story is a photograph. A novel is a film. Interesting contrasting images that are being used there by Laurie Moore. And finally, short fiction seems more targeted. Hand grenades of ideas, if you will. When they work, they hit, they explode, and you never forget them. So you notice the use of those dramatic material verbs: work, hit, explode. Okay, so some pretty strong claims about the importance of short stories in the body of literature. Okay, so you have various choices open to you when you're writing short stories. Think about the opening that you might have to a short story. You've got choices. I mean, it may well be that you want to start your short story in a fairly conventional way with the orientation, where you, the writer, give information about the time, place, and character. That's called orientation. Here's an example by Philip Pullman, the writer of the His Dark Materials series. On a cold, fretful afternoon in early October 1872, a hansom cab drew up outside the offices of Lockhart and Selby shipping agents in the financial heart of London, and a young girl got out and paid the driver. That's a brilliant example of how you can use language in a very concise way and do this orientation, where you're giving us the basic details about time and place and character. And you've already got to the end of there and you're beginning to think, why? Why is a young girl getting out of a hansom cab, which is the equivalent of a taxi, and they've got the money to pay a driver? Okay, so it's already beginning to intrigue you. So there's your orientation. That's one possible way of starting a story. Another possible way is doing an abstract. So this is where your writer begins with a comment that somehow establishes the theme of the narrative and maybe foreshadows what's to come. Here's a very famous example. This is the first sentence of a novel from the early 1960s by L.P. Hartley called The Go-Between. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. It's a great quotation. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. So it sets up the story that this is going to be set in the past, and therefore all of the kind of assumptions that a current day reader have, you need to forget them, because the past is like a foreign country. They do things differently there. So there's an abstract. You have other choices as well. It may be that you want to do Inmidius Res. This is that Latin term that means the writer places the reader into the middle of the narrative. Here's an example. This is from The Road by Cormac McCarthy, brilliant novel. When he woke in the woods in the dark and the cold of the night, he'd reach out to touch the child sleeping beside him. Now that's the first sentence of the narrative. Who is he? Who is it referring to, this third person singular pronoun? We don't know yet. Why are they in the woods in the dark and the cold? Why is this person reaching out to touch the child sleeping beside him? So it raises all sorts of questions. So Inmidius Res is a good way of doing that. You could also do In Ultimus Res. Excuse me while I put the light on. Here we go. That's where the writer begins at the end and then finishes at a similar point. So a famous example would be the beginning of the novel Slaughterhouse-Five, which is about the Second World War. All has happened, more or less. And you're thinking, this demonstrative pronoun, what is it referring to? Okay, so you have lots of choices open to you as a writer about how you actually start your story. You also have choices in terms of your narrative perspective. It may be that you want to narrate your story from the first person narrative, where the narrator is the protagonist or is the central character in the story. And if you're doing this, readers need to watch out for first person pronouns. So things like I, me, my, or our, or us. Okay. Now you need to think about the sort of benefits, advantages of doing a first person narrative, but you also need to think about the kind of constraints as well. So if I were you, I would pause the video there and think, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using a first person narrative? Okay, I hope you've had a bit of a think about that. I mean, one of the great advantages of the first-person narrative is that you're getting into the mind, the psychology of a particular character. So you're immersing yourself in the thoughts and the feelings of that particular person. So as a reader, you should feel a sense of empathy with that person. Okay, so first-person narrative is very good for that. It can be interesting as well if the person who is telling the story is somebody who is perhaps unreliable. what's called an unreliable narrator. So maybe you are hearing the first person narrative done by a criminal who, for example, has done some kind of horrendous crime. So to what extent are you as the reader going to be complicit in this by empathizing with the voice of a criminal? So your first person narrative can be very, very interesting. It can also be tricky as well because it limits how much description that you're going to be doing. Let's say that you're wanting to include quite a lot of figurative, metaphorical language that's going on in your story. Well, that's going to be difficult if your first person narrative is not necessarily somebody who is a writer or a poet who is used to, producing figurative language. Okay, so it's difficult. It also means that you can only describe things that have directly happened to that one person. So there are benefits, but there are also constraints. It may be that you want to do second person narrative. So that's where you do it all from the perspective of you, that second person pronoun. That's slightly unusual. That's quite interesting in that you can put the reader directly into the shoes of the action that's happening in the story. A word of warning, however, it can become quite tiresome to be following a second person narrative all the way. So I would perhaps have an experiment with using second person narrative, but I would think very carefully about, whether it does actually confer very good advantages to you. And then you've got third person narrative. And there are different types of this. So you've got third person objective narration, where the narrator tells a third person story, but the narrator only describes the character's behavior and dialogue, and the narrator doesn't reveal any of the character's thoughts and feelings. So that's quite interesting because you as the reader will be left to infer the character's thoughts and feelings simply based on the description that goes on. So, for example, on the road that I just showed the beginning of, a lot of that is third-person objective narration, where we don't get described the man's thoughts and feelings, so we as the reader have to infer these. You then have third-person limited narration, where the narrator's perspective is limited to the internal workings of one character, where the narrator reveals the thoughts and feelings of one character through explicit narration. Okay? And then finally, you've got third-person omniscient. So this is where the narrator grants the readers the most access to characters' thoughts and feelings, and the narration will reveal more than one character's internal workings. So this is a very good way of doing it, your third-person omniscient, because you can hop into the mind of a particular character and show what they are thinking and feeling, but then you can also transfer to other characters and to describe what they are thinking and feeling as well. Okay, so first, second, or third person narrative, they're interesting choices that you can be pursuing. You also want to be thinking about narrative structure. When you're thinking about narrative structure, it's not a bad idea to think about the theorist Todorov, who was a Bulgarian academic who did a lot of work looking at traditional folk stories and to see the narrative structures. And he observed that in those kind of traditional oral stories, there was usually a 5-part narrative structure. Stories usually started with a state of equilibrium, where things were placid and we're introduced to the characters and all is well with the world, reasonably. You then have some sort of sense of disruption, okay? The third aspect of this is a recognition of the disruption, where the characters in the story try to do something to solve the disruption that's happening. That goes into the fourth structure. And then at the end there, if it's a traditional kind of story, then you get the reinstatement of the initial equilibrium. Okay, now how this would work in a kind of modern day media text, let's think about an episode, let's say, of Sherlock, which of course was tremendously popular some time ago, around about 2012, 2013. So in most of the episodes, you have this kind of structure being followed, where you've got Sherlock and Watson, the two main characters. They are relaxing, they are together at the beginning of the episode, we are in a state of equilibrium, and then there's some kind of disruption that happens. Maybe Moriarty arrives on the scene, so an action or a character will do something that creates disruption. It maybe creates a case for them to solve. The recognition of the disruption is where the two of them begin their quest to find the solution, maybe apprehend the villain. You've got the attempt to repair the disruption, where the narrative continues until we're leading towards the climax where the villain is confronted. And then at the end, we have the reinstatement of the initial equilibrium. So Sherlock and Watson kind of go back to the beginning, their opening position. Okay, so that's how it would be applied in a fairly conventional way. What I would say is that lots of narratives are unconventional. So non-linear narratives and circular narratives have a structure that's often not quite so straightforward. And if you're experimenting with structure, it's a good idea to move backwards and forwards in time and use a kind of flashback technique, which you'll be very familiar with from watching lots of films. So you could do a circular narrative, which may begin at the end of the story in terminus res and work its way back to the origins of the narrative. And so circular narratives are often only understood clearly by the reader at the end of a story. So that could be quite interesting and fun to read, where at the beginning of the story it's quite enigmatic and mysterious and there are lots of unknowns. And really you can only put the bits together of the jigsaw by the time you get to the end of the narrative. So you might well consider experimenting with a non-chronological structure in your story. Okay, so I hope that video has laid out some of the choices that are open to you in terms of your structure, in terms of your narrative perspective, and other things that you might want to think about that writers are doing, great writers are doing on their short stories. Okay, we're going to leave it there. I hope that's been a useful video for you. And in the last video, we'll talk a little bit more about, when you get down to actually write your own short story, what are the real essential things of a short story. Thank you.